Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Goodman, and I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about your 2022 Analytics Strategy Playbook. Now, I've been fortunate enough over the last almost 20 years to wear so many different hats in this world of data and analytics. Like many folks, I started or found my passion for data as an analyst, right? Just getting started. And then that interest or passion kind of evolved into the world of data visualization and dashboards and executive. And that's really where I got a lot of exposure at the executive level, building executive cockpits and dashboards for many large enterprise companies. And I've been able to kind of channel that as a consultant, running a software company, a boutique consulting, and then a software company that specialized in geospatial analytics for about 10 years. And kind of my own path and journey landed me at Reliant Funding about 3 years ago. And really for me, coming off of running a software company for 10 years, and having worked as a consultant, help other companies build these playbooks, it was really a challenge for me to step into a company that's a financial services company. And they, as I would say, were fairly early in their path as a modern data-driven organization. So it's kind of been a challenge and a lot of fun for a company of that size to implant an analytics strategy and then help from the point of, or at least my point of arrival, help Reliant Funding help its own organizations from top to bottom reach point of arrival, which we'll talk a lot about in our analytics playbook today. So I'm going to share my screen and we can kind of jump right in. So the question, obviously, when we talk about these analytics playbooks is, what does that mean? Point of, I keep talking and I'll allude to throughout this presentation, point of departure, point of arrival. What I always tell my team or any organization that I get to work with is, at the end of the day, we're where we are right now, but we need to know exactly where we're going. Like, what is euphoria? What is the point of arrival where we say to ourselves, we look around the room and we say, man, we've made it, right? And for an analytics team, it's usually where you're using data to drive decision. And we've said that as an industry, if you've been around long enough, we've been talking about data-driven organizations. And this, I've been doing it for 20 years. This predates me for a very long time, right? And I think for every company, it's very different, right? I have this screenshot of a self-driving car with literally without a steering wheel. That's where we're headed. As it freaks us out, right? It's very scary. But like my dad joke every time I get on a meeting where I'm on a Zoom call and I'm like waiting for the first 5 minutes for everyone to figure out how to use their headset and phone, is it's like, how the heck do I have a car that drives me to the office every day, yet we can't all like use technology to get on a darn phone call, in 2 or 3 minutes? And that joke is true, because at the end of the day, a company like Tesla, right, that's revolutionizing computer vision and is helping everyone reach this point where ultimately we're not going to have a steering wheel. Like, those are very complex, interesting problems that a company like Tesla can solve, right? Respective of all of your organizations out there, right? Those are not the kind of problems that we're solving day to day at Reliant Funding. It's just a completely, our journey, our path, where we're at, and the kinds of problems that we are solving are very different. However, we have the same challenges, right? At the end of the day, in order for us to use data or cultivate enough data, we all have the same, relatively the same technology capabilities available to us. We have the same kind of industry knowledge and competency, like information is readily available. And generally, we have a lot of the skills, similar skills and abilities from a personnel perspective across our organization. Now, a company like Tesla is going to find and hire and pay the brightest minds out there to help remove the steering wheel. But I like to think, like many of you as leaders out there, that your respective teams, that whether it's the whole team or a subset of your team, they're rock stars in their own right. So it's like, how do we get all the people on our teams aligned and working in the same direction to reach that point of arrival? And that's a big part of what the playbook aims to do, right? It aims to, a playbook really is just a series of organizing principles. One, to hopefully define where your point of arrival is going to be, but then what do we need at our disposal? Like, what do we need to organize and keep track of? And how do we communicate back to all of our stakeholders, top to bottom, how we're doing on this path to our point of arrival? And that's the whole point. So today, we're going to dig into that playbook, right? We're going to look at what does that look like? How are other companies doing that? And ultimately, I'll share some stories along the way of how I've implemented, like when rubber meets the road, how we've implemented the playbook where I'm at right now. So the outcome of having this playbook, and this is kind of the organizing principles of this presentation, is one, having the playbook, using a playbook is all about influencing decisions, right? In order for you as an analytics or BI or data science leader, ultimately, you're going to have to influence people top to bottom to get resources and budget and hire the best people possible for you to be able to implement your strategy. So to do that, it's all about decisions, actions, and outcomes, not capabilities, not data, and not technology. The second outcome of having this playbook is it's really about building trust and confidence, right? Your peers, whether you're an executive or it doesn't really matter what level of the organization you're at. And I would even say, if you're not an executive and you want to take that next level in your career, this would be how you would do it, right? Because I can tell you right now, if you have an analytics strategy or a BI strategy or any strategy, but you don't have these series of organizing principles, or certainly don't have a way to communicate and share this information, this is how you take the next level. And a big part of that is learning how to do proper goal setting, how to build KPIs, not only help other parts of the organization develop and define and manage their KPIs and metrics, but how do you as an analytics leader define your own goals and KPIs and metrics, which we'll jump into and talk about today. And then, as we all very well know, it's all about building a competency, right? Building that scaffolding for your organization to be able to reach or get to that point of arrival. Where you don't do that is where every 1 or 2 years you start over, right? And I see that, for better or worse, happening with a lot of companies, right? They reach a certain point, they plateau, and then they take 3 steps backwards saying, oh, we need new technology, we need new this, we need new that, as opposed to really thinking about the long-term path, the competency center, and building the platform and the scaffolding to get where you need to be. So we're going to talk about all these things. What is the playbook actually? I keep talking about playbooks. What the heck does this thing actually look like on paper? This is a screenshot that I took of the analytics playbook that we use at Reliant Funding. This is literally the Confluence page. So Confluence, think of, if you're not familiar with what that is, it's document knowledge management. So if you were using Google Docs or SharePoint, or some type of platform where you can take a bunch of articles and organize them together, this is a screenshot of it. And so you're more than welcome to read on my screen or pause your screen what all of these points are. I believe as part of this I'm going to provide a template, a Word document template that explains all 30 of these areas that you can use by all means for your company. But these are the 5 areas, right? The objectives and team, the who is always the most important, along with your objectives and goals. The priorities and outcomes, not for analytics, but for the business. What is the priority and outcomes for your various lines of business? What is the investments in ROI you're making in data and in analytics? If you don't have a return on investment story for your data analytics, data science, data governance, all these initiatives and organizations, it becomes very hard to get approval and budget to try to bring in the best possible people and technology. Data and technology is data and technology. And then process and execution. What is your actual process? In our case, we're Agile, right? We do run a Scrum, actually. And so what our internal process is, how do we train? Like, what is the actual process? So these 5 areas make up the playbook. And then for these 5 organizing principles, you then have all of the detail that you need that explains top to bottom what your strategy is. And you can see that I have a little visual, and I use this all the time. I mean, I've shown this to our board, right? The idea at Reliant Funding, right, is we have marketing and sales, right, like many companies out there. In our case, operations just happens to be originations, right? So if you're not in financial services, this funnel would be some other type of operations. And then the other part of our operations happens to be portfolio management. The point is, at the end of the day, we have this process, and it's all about that feedback loop of creating predictability for organization, right? So we're using data to track how much, how fast, at what rate do we convert customers through our process. And then we're using that data to then help create that feedback loop to the top of the funnel, to the top of the organization. And ultimately, the goal or outcome that we're hoping for and working toward is improving our predictability all the way through our process. So how do we start the conversation, right? When I started the conversation at Reliant Funding, I was very, very clear that we are not a data-driven company. And I'm willing to bet, like, I will put my career, I'll put anything on it, that I could walk into most companies and within a few days determine that, like, data-driven is aspirational, not the way that the organization actually runs. Because data-driven means that you have a process, you have a system that feeds you data, or feeds you information, right? And you take action on that information without questioning it, without using a gut, your gut to kind of deviate from what was recommended. And at the end of the day, really what most companies are or operate on, which is great, by the way. I'm not diminishing the value of saying that you're data driven, where really the reality is you're using data to influence action or decisions, right? Data driven is really where there's no human involved at all, right? Or the human element is minimal, right? Just to take the action. But this is good. This is a good conversation starter, right? There's nothing more powerful than going into your business leaders and saying, slam the table and say, we're not data driven, but we sure as heck need to be. And so what does that mean? It means that data influences decisions. And the reality is, the more accurate and more consistent our data is, in other words, the more that we treat our data as an asset, the more confidence and the more trust that we're going to have in the information that we get from our analytics and BI and whatever and data sciences, the more confidence and trust we're going to have in what's being fed to us. And ultimately, there's this like inflection point, right, that you reach. And it may, And I say this inflection point, it could be for one part of the business, one decision that you have to make. But once you reach that point, you're then able to use data to actually drive the action. And so this chart is what I use to really establish this level of understanding that, one, we're not data driven, but two, I'm adamant and passionate to get our company to the point where we can be data driven. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to take investment. It's going to take time. It's going to take grit, but we're going to do it. And we're going to focus on the most impactful decisions that we need to make as a company. And we're going to work to make ourselves or get ourselves to the point where we're using data to make decisions. And at the end of the day, as you can see in the title, it always leads back to data governance. If you don't have data governance, if you don't have a process and rigor and investment in treating your data as an asset, this becomes, this curve reaching this inflection point becomes very difficult, if not near impossible. So what's crazy is I explain over and over again, and I'm sure many of you are probably nodding your heads, that you can have all the technology, you can have all the data scientists in the world, but if you don't have the data, right, it's not available, it's not consistent, it's not at least reasonably clean, especially for a smaller company where you can't benefit from the law, law of large numbers. That's a tongue twister. The smaller the company, the smaller the data, the more accurate it needs to be, frankly. So as I always say, all paths lead back to data governance. So if you're driving your analytics strategy without a focus on data governance, you're setting yourselves up to fail. There's no doubt about that. Okay, so the second, and mind you, the playbook in itself has an entire section on data governance. And there's a handful of key points that you need to hit on data governance. But if you do have a data governance committee and meetings and rigor behind data governance, you're certainly, when we talk about building that foundation and scaffolding, you're certainly at a great place. In our case, right, when I landed at Reliant Funding, there wasn't a rigor, there wasn't the level of data governance that you would need to reach that inflection point. So the second part of the playbook, or outcome of the playbook, is all about building trust, right? And the 3 points or recommendations on building trust is consistency counts. Having regimented meetings, updates, even if you have to bring bad news, that consistency is really, really important. Because, and I've made the mistake, right? I've made it on multiple occasions, right, over my 3 years, where I'll get everyone excited, we'll kick things off, and then we'll have a lull in the communication, right? And I've found, right, whether there's no news, right, because these things take time and energy, having that regular update cadence is really, really important. Second, focus on high impact, high pain initiatives. And we'll talk about how we organize that. And then the last point that we're going to dig into is around this concept of creating a system of trust, right? And I'm actually going to work backwards. I'll start with this concept of system of trust. And once again, these are the conversations that I'm having, right, of explaining the what and the why, right? When we think of a system of truth or trust, specifically around analytics, we're talking about delivery of information that you generally don't question, right? You consume the information on a regular basis. You have that aha moment, right? You kind of reach that whatever thought or action you're going to have, and you move on with your day and you don't even think about it, right? So if you think about weather, now I live in San Diego. That's not like a humble brag, but I don't look at the weather app, right? I literally don't need the weather app because it's 70 something almost year round. But if you think about it, right, at the end of the day, the weather app is just a presentation of many, many different weather types of weather sensors, right, that capture data in real time all day, every day. They're processed all around the globe. They're fed, they're curated, they're put through many different types of models. And ultimately, your weather app is a predictive analytic, right? It's in some cases, it's showing near real-time information based on sensors. But generally, what we're looking at here is a forecast or prediction of what it would be based on history, based on weather sensors, based on a whole bunch of fairly complex analytics, right? And we don't think about this. It just happens, we consume it, and we go, right? The other one is our, that's probably more near and dear to me, coming from geospatial analytics, is our census, right? And our demographics and firmographics information that many companies use, right? We survey in our census, whether we go through every 4 years, we survey everyone across the US. It is centralized into a database. The data is cleaned, processed, curated, and then provided out. And then we use the statistics from our census in many, many different models. And so this is a great example. These are end-to-end processes from data capture all the way to delivery that we have as systems of truth. And so ultimately, as a company, or as a private or public company, the idea is to create these various systems, right, levels or layers that ultimately result in an overall system of truth, right, that is generally trusted, utilized, and becomes a foundation for everything you do next. And we'll talk a little bit about that when it comes to data science, because I know that for many of you, including myself, that is a key area of an investment around predictive analytics, scoring, AI, and so on. So in this section around outcomes, right? One of the things I mentioned in my bullet slide is choosing the most important initiatives, right? If you're trying to build momentum and you're trying to build credibility as an analytics organization, it's so important to focus on the most critical issues in your organization. And so what we do, right, on my team, and what a lot of companies do, is they take initiatives, projects for one or multiple lines of business, and we rank them or we rate them. So I have two measurements. I have the degree of business pain, or I like using pain. A lot of companies say challenge, right? You have business challenges, right? Things that occur that cause a great deal of pain to the business. Now, the other axis here is the impact to the company, right? So something that is happening in the company, a pain or an opportunity, that if you solve that with data, it has a dramatic impact on the company, either presumably financial, right? That's typically what we're looking at. So you have this concept where you can have something that causes a tremendous amount of pain, but if you solve that pain, the impact of the company is not major, right? So those typically tend to be reactive, right? Because what happens is something could be very painful, and then over time, the impact grows to the point where you have to be very much reactive. Really, where we focus all of our energy is high pain, high impact. And so the idea is we have a spreadsheet, a centralized spreadsheet of all of the business initiatives. And if your organization's like mine, as an analytics or data or leader, you may strategically have a handful of initiatives as a company, but then when you dig into all the lines of business that you may service, or one line of business, you may have 10, 15 things on the docket over a period of time. So the idea is that I walk around literally line of business by line of business, and I uncover what are the initiatives for this quarter, for this year. We list them all down. We talk about what are the data-driven or data-influenced decisions that need to be made as a part of this initiative. And then we say, okay, if I come in with my analytics SWAT team and we implement a solution for you guys, right? What is it really going to do to the company, dollars and cents? And if we don't do this, what is the level of pain that you're going to feel of not having this in place? And we rank these things 1 to 5. We create a combined score, and then we plot them on the matrix. And that's how we determine what we're going to work on. So in that scenario, once again, where we're having to explain why we're working the things that we're working, having a methodology to put everything into one big bucket, use data, right? It is subjective, right? But you're not, as an analytics leader, you're not rating these things. You're telling the business leaders to rank these things, pain and impact. So to be able to go to my executive team or my board and say, look, we have all these initiatives that we want to do as a company. We've had all of our business leaders, we've surveyed all of our business leaders, right? We've transformed that into data. And as an analytics leader, I'm using data to prioritize and dictate the criticality of things that we're going to work. That is a very, very powerful tool to say no, if nothing else. So that's how we talk about not just solving high impact business challenges, but actually putting some rigor, putting some data behind it to explain and communicate and show the progress over time. So when it comes to putting data to work, this is obviously a big part of what we do with analytics and BI or data science, right? When we talk about the need for data governance or investment in data management or data, like a lot of the things that are just not pretty or not sexy, everything I communicate when it comes to our data management and our data governance strategy ties back to what is the outcome, right? I can't put data to work if I don't have the data available and ready for my data science team, for my BI team, and we end up burning 90% of our time dealing with data issues as opposed to building solutions and ultimately putting our data to work. So when it comes to communicating and getting resources, I typically focus on how we're going to put data to work. Now, when we talk about the output, right, the reports, the dashboards, the scores, the predictive analytics, adoption is everything. And accountability for adoption is everything. So thinking about the full life cycle, right? Our business leaders are saying, hey, here's a high impact, high priority pain that we have, and we're going to invest time and resources to produce a solution. If we build a solution and we deploy it, and that solution is not utilized, because once again, go back to that curve, right? We don't trust the data. We don't think that the information that we're providing is correct or accurate. Your adoption dies. The influence of what you just produced dies. And ultimately, you just spent and burned a lot of time building something that no one uses. So when we talk about putting data to work, we really spend as leaders a lot of time thinking through or working on acceptance criteria and making sure that our business leaders are engaged in what we're producing. And as I always say, release early and often, right? Rather than this big bang approach to building analytics, it's very much a collaborative effort, getting our analysts ingrained in understanding the perspectives of our business leaders. It takes more time, but ultimately what we're after is the maximize user adoption of what we're building. Otherwise, from my perspective, it's a failure. Okay, so we're going to transition from how do we build trust, right? Where we talk about, like I said, adoption, about prioritization. Now we're going to talk a little bit about goal setting, because this is an area where many companies still struggle. And it's arguably one of the most important things, right? To go back to our the slide, right, where I had the self-driving car and the map, right? If you don't know what your point of arrival is, it's kind of hard to drive there, right? And so a big part of that is measurements, right? Defining measurements. Now, when we talk about objective setting and goals and point of arrival, that's typically like a top-down thing. When we work with individual lines of businesses, one of the challenges that many companies have, and Reliant Funding is not alone, or certainly in the same scenario, right, is that you have too many KPIs. You have a lot of discrepancies in targets and timelines. Definitions of the same metric differ across lines of business, excuse me, or even within a line of business. And then once again, why I started this presentation with that curve and all paths lead back to data governance, the lack of trust in the data, right? So what happens is, oh, I don't trust this metric is telling me what I believe to be true. So therefore, I'm going to create my own flavor of this metric that I think, based on my experience and my gut and my understanding of what's happening, I'm going to create my own version of this metric and use that to communicate what's going on. These things happen every single day. And so this is obviously a challenge, and we'll talk a little bit about ways to deal with that. But one of my favorite stories or examples of this, I'm not sure, maybe some of you know this story around the Mars Climate Orbiter. This was a satellite that was launched out into space, and basically it was a catastrophic failure. The satellite defected in the middle of space, and the reason is because you had two disparate teams working on the project, and one team was in the US and one was international, and one used the metric, in the US we don't use the metric system, and so because they were using literally two different systems of measurement and they were sharing numbers, the two didn't match. And literally it was 125 million throwaway because they simply weren't using the same unit of measurement, right? Now, hopefully none of you are experience $125 million mistake, but that's a pretty big one, right? These things are happening all the time in many organizations. And so ultimately, really it boils down to using some type of framework around designing metrics and KPIs, whether you're using WIG or SMART, or we use BIDF, BI delivery formula, which is a kind of a mashup or a hack of SMART and WIG and other methodologies, but specific for analytics. For those of you who are not familiar, I would just Google BIDF, and I think you'll be pretty excited on how that methodology works. But really it all boils down to four things, right? Where are we going? Where are we? How do we get here? And what should I do next? Right? And these four areas define what you're doing, right? Where are we going? That's your objectives and goals. Where the heck are we right now? That's really where you're setting your metric. Like, what are you using to measure where you're at right now? How did we get here is where really your BI, your analytics, your trending helps you describe of like what the heck happened. And then what should we do next? Which is an area that I think we're all working heavily on, is where we're doing predictive analytics, machine learning, AI, try to remove the human element as much as possible, or once again, use data to influence as much as possible what we should do next. So when I describe and help move our company along on this journey, this is kind of how I present. And all four of these areas independent of each other are areas of investment that are either driven by or steered by, at least at Reliant Funding, by the analytics company. Now, at minimum, you should have a seat at the table in all 4 of these areas. When it comes to measuring the progress purely for the analytics strategy, this is the tool that we currently use. So if you remember, when I opened, I had that what does an analytics strategy playbook look like, where I had a list of those 20 areas, right, organized 1 through 5. This is how, on a quarterly basis, I communicate where are we. So that orange circle, and by the way, the goal is to create a perfect circle, right? And your starting point is at the middle, right, at 0. And ultimately, for all of these areas, you're wanting to ensure that every one of these areas exists, meaning they're well defined, they're understood, and they're signed off. So that's that, like, I think we've all seen that, like, Gartner data governance curve, right? Where, like, the first point is just understanding that you need data governance. That's like number 1, right? So this concept of level of existence is really where we're saying, is there an actual strategy in place? And do we believe that strategy is sound? The green area is execution on that strategy, right? So once we've defined what the strategy is, and we start deploying resources, implementing solutions, green is, and when execution meets existence, that means we've reached our point of arrival, right? So to tie it all the way back into that journey and explaining and communicating the journey, that's where, like, where the 2 meet is where you've reached that point in your journey. And typically, at least from my perspective and at Reliant Funding, I don't go beyond a 4, because from my perspective, until you've reached this certain point of maturity in your journey, meaning that you've set a strategy and you've demonstrated that you can actually reach that point of arrival, there's like another level of mastery where we'll go from level 4 to level 5. And we haven't reached that. Now, this is also dated. If you were to look at our, this is not the Reliant Funding, just to make that clear. This is an example that I used and kind of randomized to explain the grid. This is not the Reliant Funding grid. We have a well-defined strategy where we are a circle, and there are areas that we're not perfect, but we've certainly been able to kind of reach point of arrival on many of these areas. So there is a 3rd level where you start measuring and quantifying the impact of your execution. And it just really depends on the company, how mature you are, if you're ready to even start doing that. But that's really where you know you're cooking. So the last area that we're going to focus on is this concept of creating a competency, right? Because the idea is that regardless of where you are in your journey and building and deploying your analytics strategy, hopefully all along the way you're creating knowledge, and you're creating knowledge assets for the company, right? So as I mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit about, one of the things that you have to do in creating the competency is not only creating reusable assets, but it's also creating and sharing what didn't work, right? And I think that is a habit that is either baked into how you operate, and for many people, they're fearful, right, of putting that out there. And I think once you learn to make that, once you feel comfortable making that jump or calling something a failure, right, and it may be a cultural thing too, meaning company culture, not actual culture. That's a tough hill to climb, but I can tell you with 100% certainty if you have the ability to recognize that something didn't work and can articulate why and how you're going to use that information to be better, that's almost, obviously that's not as powerful as a smashing success, but I would call that a very close second. And so at the end of the day, right, for our respective organizations, we're at various periods of our journey, right? I think most companies at this point, that if you haven't arrived at some mastery of descriptive analytics, you're probably, your company's probably on a death march, right? Like companies that haven't mastered descriptive analytics in 2022 are in trouble in the long term, right? They're probably you're probably being outmaneuvered by your competitors if you haven't mastered descriptive analytics to some degree. Because really, now you should know where you're at, how you got there, depending on the complexity of your business could be a challenge. But I think as an industry, the barrier and friction and complexity of building descriptive analytics is at an all-time low. I think where a lot of companies are right now, is certainly Reliant Funding included, is really increasing our ability to predict what's going to happen before it happens. I think for our Reliant Funding, once again, we're investing in enriching our data, trying to find and pull in as many signals, right, as humanly possible, both internal and external, about the performance of our customers, about new potential customers, so that we can predict what will happen with those merchants. When we go from predictive to prescriptive, which I know a lot of companies are investing heavily on, it's that, what do we do next, right? That prescriptive element, or automation, using data-driven automation, right? Where things are happening in an organization using data automatically without human intervention. And once again, it just depends on your industry. Some industries are very advanced and far along in these areas, right? And others are not. And then the cool part, like to tie it or bring it back to where we started, this concept of adaptive, and I know there's different names for it, but I'm calling it adaptive for our purposes together today. I joke that, just let me know when we're there, right? Back to the self-driving car. I get in my car. I think I went from Palm Springs to San Diego without touching my steering wheel or brake pedal, right? I just got in, I sat down, hit the navigation and go. And I think for some companies that is happening, right? So this is more or less to map out the journey, and certainly I use this kind of slide once again when I'm communicating and trying to plot where we are in this spectrum of analytics. At the end of the day, when I talk about and I communicate our analytics strategy, it's in this order, right? I explain that analytics at Reliant Funding, first and foremost, is a collection of people with purpose. And our purpose is to help the company understand what's happening at the same rate that it's happening. Process, when it comes to analytics process, we have a process that is very iterative, that's focused on continuous improvement, with a commitment that we are going to create, and as I always say, release early and often, meaning that as we create, as we use data, and as we learn how to use data, we want to do it side by side with the business. We want to learn together, right? There isn't this like wall, right, where our business is throwing over requirements, or frankly, where we're waiting for the business to throw over requirements. We're approaching the business saying, hey, we understand this high priority, high impact initiative, right, that's going on. We're going to work together to create, whether it's a report or a score, right? We're going to work together and we're going to learn what works and what doesn't work, so that when we deliver, when we're done or complete, we've already gone through this process multiple times so that we're ensuring that what we give you is going to be used and adopted. Once again, data is an asset, right? If data isn't treated as an asset, your analytics, your data science, and your ability to become data-driven will fail. And that's why data is at the center of the diagram, right? Everything revolves around data. Your people are most important, but your data is kind of the center of gravity. And then finally, technology. Technology is just the enabler, not the driver. As I am a little bit snarky about it, but it's 2022, and at this point, if I need to build a report or a dashboard or some type of descriptive analytic, it's all kind of the same at this point. A lot of the tools and technologies kind of all do the same thing. Your modern data platforms are built on, it's like 20 different flavors of Spark, right? I think that at the end of the day, now there are different pockets, whether it's Spark and Python, or you're a SQL shop, the big data analytics technology stack that you use definitely can differ, and some are better than others. I acknowledge that, but generally speaking, the gaps are so small and or shrinking. It's all about speed and friction, right? That's the name of the game. It's not about capabilities and features anymore. So that's kind of how I explain it. And that certainly in order to, once again, influence and help change and advance your strategy, that's kind of how I typically present it. So to kind of recap with our time here today, at the end of the day, what I've found, right, taking an analytics strategy playbook that literally I've helped or seen hundreds of companies implement, and applying that at Reliant Funding and being like in the weeds, in the trenches every day for the last 3 years. It's really about building a competency in testing, right? Because at the end of the day, even with a perfect playbook, you have to test. You have to experiment. You have to try things. You have to get the business, right, comfortable with testing and experimenting, right? So having a test framework that you're using, having everyone bought in that you're going to test and try things is really, really important. Number two, I've learned, and it's somewhat intuitive for me, but I've realized that it's not intuitive for many others, is be obsessed with knowledge management. Have at least, if you're building, right, you're quarterbacking and you're building a team, hire one person who, for whatever reason, is so organized and loves documentation, right, or structuring and organizing things. Have at least one person on the team. Like, don't have a team full of people with ADD and who love to like run around, scramble around and build stuff. You need to be obsessed with capturing the knowledge that you create, the learnings, not only for your analytics or data science teams, but also for the business and for the greater good of your company. Once again, it all boils down to like people and teams, right? But when you're team building, I've learned, and once again, it may be intuitive or instinctive for many of you, but I've had to learn or relearn this, that every team member of your analytics and data team should be able to speak intelligently to the business, right? We should, if I asked every member of my team what the top 5 KPIs that we track at the company are, they should all be able to answer and understand what our top KPIs are or metrics. If they don't, then by definition, your team is not aligned to the company objectives, right? So understanding the business at some fundamental level, understanding the data obviously is going to be very important, understanding the process, because it's that some of the nuances on the process will help them be proactive in raising the flag, hey, this doesn't look right. And then once again, knowing the technology is important. So continuously training and making sure that people are competent in the technologies that you invest in are important. And then same place we started, right? Continuous data management, cross-pollination with all of your analytics teams. If you're investing in data science and machine learning and scoring the way that we are, you know, probably through trials and tribulations, that your data science team is wasting an exorbitant amount of time data wrangling. And so what we've done and are continuously doing is ensuring there's this continuous cross-pollination of knowledge, of understanding what data science or what data sciences teams are working on. So that's very, very, very important. And so with that, with those lessons learned, I'll close. I thank you very, very much to the team, for the Wiiisdom team, for having me at Decisive 2022. I love talking about this. I would love to continue the conversation. I would love your feedback, even on the presentation and the content. And certainly, as I mentioned, we will make available the template of the playbook for everyone who attends Decisive 2022. And yeah, reach out to me via email, and I'm happy to engage anyone to talk a little bit more or take ideas and recommendations of what you found in your own journeys and paths building and deploying analytics strategy. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful conference, and hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.